Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Mike Burton. I have the honor and privilege of serving as the Public Affairs Conference Chair this year. I'm very pleased that you're here to participate in our program on sustainability. I hope that many of you have already had the opportunity to hear panels or other parts of our program, and that you're as excited as I am to hear tonight from Dr. Brady Deaton. At the end of Dr. Deaton's presentation, we will have the opportunity for some questions and answers. So please remain seated, and we'll bring a microphone to you, and we'll be able to call on you if you raise your hand to accept any questions. Many of you are already aware that the public affairs mission is unique to Missouri State University, and we hope that this program will inspire students to participate in leadership in the future, ethical leadership in the future. And so we want to model that, and tonight I think we have a fantastic representative of that. In his career, I believe Dr. Brady Deaton has exemplified that, in fact, all three components of our public affairs mission. So the other two components besides ethical leadership, as you probably know, is the idea of community engagement. And the third, of course, is cultural competence. And I believe that Dr. Deaton has probably traveled in as many countries as exist on our planet at present, and probably some have had name changes during the course of your career. Dr. Deaton is here with us tonight, having done pretty well for a guy from East Kentucky. He's received a couple of degrees from University of Kentucky, a couple of graduate degrees from University of Wisconsin. He's worked at a few different universities, including Tennessee, Virginia Tech, and finally at University of Missouri, serving not only as a professor in agricultural economics, but also as an administrator, having served as a department head and also most recently as chancellor of the University of Missouri. So we're pleased not only to have someone of his experience and caliber, but also of his concern. Because before he actually finished his undergraduate degree, he became one of the early Peace Corps volunteers, a little program a guy named Jack Kennedy got started back in the 1960s. And during that time, Dr. Deaton had the opportunity to teach ag economics, to teach ag education. Having started out as a dairy genetics guy, he switched to ag economics, which is a very important set of tools for assessing what people value. And I think that you'll find one of the things that Dr. Deaton values is the well-being of others. And I hope that in your lives you will emulate that. Dr. Deaton, having served as a Peace Corps volunteer in service through land-grant universities, and now serving as a chairman for the Board on Food and Agricultural Development for U.S. Agency for International Development, has had a lifetime of service that exemplifies what we hope the public affairs mission at Missouri State University will accomplish. So with that, I welcome Dr. Deaton. Please join me in welcoming him to the stage.
It's all organized here. Thanks very much. Michael, thank you very much for the introduction. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, give a signal if I fade away at some point. I'm really delighted to be here this evening, and I must say that it's great to be back in Springfield and to see some old and make some new friends, and this has been a wonderful time for me. I have to comment, though, that Eastern Kentucky has been good preparation for a number of us. I see my colleague Jim Baker back there. We grew up about an hour from each other in Eastern Kentucky, didn't know each other until we came to Missouri. But it's been fun, and I've had the opportunity to visit with Dr. Michael Clark, one of your physicians here in town, and to meet and see again an old colleague, president of the institution, Cliff Smart, whom I was able to see yesterday, and Anson Elliott, I understand, is in the audience. So I'm simply revealing to you that there are a number of people here that I feel very warm toward, and it's a thrill to be with you tonight. Let me begin by simply telling you where I'm going to end up, and that is in praising the values, the commitment, and the dedication of this generation of students, you who are in the audience, and what you represent. And I think when I go through what I'm going to be saying, I hope you feel that sense with me that you have unlimited potential for making a contribution to the world. You're well prepared, and you're going to do that. And it is a new generation. As I talk to people of my age and profile, we're really looking to the future. And I'm going to tell you about a program we have underway at the University of Missouri that began after I left my chancellor's role at the end of 2013, having served about 9.5 years. I've had a wonderful career that's been very stimulating for me, and I'm going to share a bit of that with you this evening. And Going back to my Peace Corps days in Thailand and some of the experiences I had there, you'll see on the left profile. And as Jim Baker knows, if you've plowed with horses and mules in your farms in eastern Kentucky, you can plow with a water buffalo. So that's what I was doing as a volunteer as I ran an experiment, really, on grain sorghum, looking at fertilizer, and I was out plowing the field, which shocked all my fellow teachers. They usually have someone else doing that for them. But for me, it was a great experience and an eye-opener in terms of career possibilities. Then in my role on faculty and working at Tennessee, Virginia Tech, I became very involved in a variety of international programs following my Peace Corps experience. I worked 2 summers in South America, where, in fact, my wife was a participant in Ecuador on a project that I was leading. And we got married the following summer, and 50 years later, here I stand with 4 grown children and 7 grandchildren. So it's been a productive relationship, you might say, and we thank the studies we did as students, as undergraduates, like many of you in the room here, even then, taking special problems, doing special studies, going beyond the expected, and trying to do those things that excited you intellectually, spiritually, and emotionally, and following a path of what we know and have learned in our universities and in science. So I'm going to take a few minutes to not only paint this early period, but to talk about the role that universities play in working with other countries around the world, and then bring that full circle back to why it's so vital that you as students be engaged in this dialogue. I was just thrilled to see the theme of this conference, sustainability and practice, consensus and consequences, and the emphasis and the theme of this conference, and I applaud you for what you've done to bring a wonderful group of people together. I feel jealous only because I've not had the chance to hear everyone, but your outreach to the community is something remarkable that we in our university life need to be doing a great deal more of. So I am happy to see this emphasis on sustainability and practice because we need more emphasis on that in everything that we're doing. And it requires the contribution of every single discipline we have in our universities. And you as students, I know, if you're like the students I'm working with on the Columbia campus of the University of Missouri, you are hungry to learn what other disciplines are learning. And I'll tell you how we dealt with that when I come to the conclusion of what I'm going to talk about here. I first, though, wanted to emphasize something that I know many of you have seen, and that is that we're now at 7+ billion in population globally, and that we're headed toward 10 billion. The estimates vary from 9 to 11, actually, by 2050, requiring significantly more food production. So to those of us who come from an agricultural background and agricultural sciences, and I will emphasize those, this is an incredible challenge. The United Nations, in their strategic development goals, with the aim of solving poverty by 2030 in the world, have estimated we need at least 35% more agricultural production by 2030. The projections are somewhere in the 60 to 70% more production by 2050. So we're going to have a lot more people, a lot more mouths to feed, and it's going to require the very best that we know in science and in human understanding. And I cannot overemphasize that latter aspect, because it's the major in a university in English and music and humanities and philosophy that will be making just as significant a contribution as the scientists in biology or areas of agriculture, chemistry, and engineering. And students need to understand that. We find our students increasingly understand that more than I think my generation did. There is no caste system among what you're majoring in today. And our students are trying to learn from each other in a new and exciting way because the problems that we face in the world require that broad perspective, not a narrow technical perspective. And as you know, most wars in the world have been fought between some of the most sophisticated countries in the world technically, but they obviously were lacking something in moral conviction and in their sense of how to govern together and live together as a community. And that's what we hope we can aspire to as we gain in our sense of civilization. We're becoming more urban, of course, and making a real challenge for how much we can grow food in urban areas. Most food is still produced in the rural areas of the country that's consuming the food. We've not had any decline in the protein content of our diets, so that part of this demand for food driven by population is because the protein component and the animal component continues to increase, and vegetable protein can to some extent meet that need, and it may continue to. That depends on people's taste. But each of those taste differences makes a difference in how we approach the production aspects of what we're doing in society. I wanted to point to, I'll come back to this point in a minute, that is that in poor countries of the world, people have to spend 60 to 80% of their income, sometimes more, on food. If you grew up on a hillside farm, as I did, with a family of 9, we grew almost everything that we ate. And we had little time to fool around with any new ventures in our crop production system because we were using every ounce of labor we had just to survive. And recently, I've run into the term bushmeat in discussions of the Ebola crisis particularly. I realized I grew up probably eating about as much bushmeat, meaning hunting and fishing, which is what we did a great deal of when we weren't out on the farm working. And that background, frankly, has enabled me to understand a great deal more about the societies that I've worked with in different countries of the world. But when you're spending this much of your income on food, food is the first claimant, and any aberration in that shakes the political profile and the social stability of the country. So it creates real problems. The poor countries of the world, you see here in blue, not surprising. These are the areas where hunger is a real issue still, where food deficits are occurring, undernourishment is at its greatest levels. And as you can see here, not surprising, that's concentrated in the African region. If you want to just look at those really regional population projections and where the growth is expected to be in the future. Between now and 2050, in fact, there will be 1 billion plus people in the African continent below the age of 18. If you haven't spent a little bit of time, go to a Google map and look at where the population of the world is today. We have in our country here, I believe it's about roughly 330 million people. China has, I believe, Jim, 1.4 billion and climbing, even at a slow rate. India, over 1 billion. Africa will be 1 billion. In Nigeria alone, the projections are by 2050, the country of Nigeria, which now has over 200 million people, as I recall. So there are some massive population centers out there demanding the food that we produce in the world and the other goods, and we have to be very market sensitive as we look at these issues around the world. The most disturbing recent trend that I have seen, and I got this slide from the North American representative of the FAO, Vimlendra Sharan, who was on our campus a couple of weeks ago. And we have had success now running almost on 30 years in reducing the amount of poverty in the world, increasing relative income, and reducing child stunting. The last 20 years, it's been remarkable. And even as that's reversed, since 2014, there has been an uptick in the amount of undernutrition, in the amount of poverty in the world. Real surprising. Child stunting has continued to decline through this period. But the fear is, of course, that that's not going to continue. These are very, very disturbing figures that if the trend continues, we think it's due principally to the amount of conflict that's going on in the world today. And conflict is linked very much with food and food shortages. And this is where all of us as social scientists have to be concerned. I want to take a moment on this burden of malnutrition and undernutrition and child stunting. It's a tremendous burden on what we're doing in the world today. Because malnourished children underperform. Here we're talking about what happens to a child in the first 1,000 days of life. Roger Thoreau's book, some of you may know Roger Thoreau's writings on this, have been pretty extensive. And for their lifetime, it's a lifetime curse placed on a family when you have people not having the food they eat at a young age or even at an advanced age in the workforce. So you have reduced earnings. You have malnourished adults who cannot really be productive. If you've been in Haiti and look at the nutrition figures there, Mike, as we were talking about earlier, it's profound, really, the less quantity of work that can be performed on any kind of labor during the day due to the lack of nutrients. And then, of course, malnourished mothers lead to malnourished children, and a cycle that perpetuates itself. This burden is far beyond, I think, what any of us think about unless you've looked at these figures. It is really astounding what cost there is to society. Malnutrition costs $3.5 trillion per year to the global economy. Loss of productivity, increased health costs, disruptive family patterns that lead to higher costs. This is really quite a profound figure, and it's made up of about undernourishment of $2.1 trillion in costs. Obesity actually is part of that element as well, and leads to a $1.4 trillion per year costs. And issues of obesity have risen as there's more and more rural to urban migration. Remember that urbanizing factor that I talked about earlier. That leads then to greater public service costs. I've been in Ghana and Tanzania in the last few years, and the first subject that came to mind in talking to chiefs of USAID missions or ambassadors was the health condition of rural to urban migrants and the increased public health costs due heavily to the change in diet and the lack of physical activity that's led to obesity. So the issues just continue to spiral and need to be under control. And of course, child and maternal malnutrition is the most horrific aspect of this because it has such long-term consequences for society. So you can look at that a moment while I hydrate here for a bit. The loss in Africa and Asia particularly is profound in terms of what they're missing in their GNP. The inability to get ahead, to make those investments that can improve the income and the nutrition of their population. So if you look ahead, the costs to society, the trillions of dollars that are being thrown away, have to be of great concern. So it calls into question the areas of nutrition, malnutrition, undernourishment, the macronutrients that are at play here, all the biological sciences, but more importantly, child rearing practices and family structure and communities' abilities to maintain appropriate food reserves and to engage in trading for the kind of food that can keep a healthy population going. I would reemphasize what I said a moment ago. We have had tremendous success. We're now seeing an upturn, and we need new strategies and new ways of thinking about this issue. I mentioned the link between food spikes and food prices a moment ago when I mentioned the high proportion of food that a family has to spend out of its income. This is tracking the major commodities, first of all, projecting them ahead in real prices corrected for inflation to 2050. Food's going to get more expensive in many parts of the world. A very important point over here. The interesting aspect here, and you don't have to worry about figuring out all the details, is the tremendous increase in prices that occurred on some basic commodities, in this case rice. During 2007 and 2008, when we had a food shortage worldwide, complex weather patterns, diseases, led to spiraling food prices. The wages of urban workers is pegged to that food price because that's how they provide for their family. And when the price goes up very suddenly, the wages don't adjust, they go to the streets and riots. And we had documented over 30 violent changes of government as a result of food prices during this period, right through here. And you could trace it. It's been highly correlated, reported in the Foreign Affairs Journal. So this says to you in your studies, as you look at these issues, being very sensitive to the dynamics that are occurring in the global trade pattern is very much part of that. It's not just what's happening in your country. It's what's happening in the global economy that's providing the food to your country. And that can be very, very significant. So these are danger signals when we start seeing major commodity prices spike like this. Conflict, this simply is tracking the conflict, and you saw the slide earlier that pointed to the significant increases in malnutrition and poverty in the last few years. And what you see, of course, is spiraling conflict. And you don't have to look very far. I mean, from Syria to South Sudan, on and on and on, with conflicts in various places, more refugees pouring into other countries, into Europe and so forth. So much of our budgets now in USAID and in other non-governmental organizations are going into refugee camps, and we're trying to rethink the way in which we're giving aid in those places. Meanwhile, people are suffering. These are profound issues. Conflict leads to starvation. It leads to undernourishment. It leads to a lifetime curse on that population and a lifetime drain on the budgets of basically every country in the world, including the United States, because I know that you as students recognize that you're part of a global community. We don't live in isolation. We live in a very interconnected world, and we have to be concerned to the extent that we have any moral concern for the human condition, which I was reared on, and I know many of you were, which was part of my 4-H club pledge of my head to clear thinking, my heart to greater loyalty, and my hands to larger service for my club, my community, my country, and the world. That's a profound pledge. That's a set of values that says we have to be concerned, and we have to deal with these issues in whatever way and we're studying in our academic profile. Climate continues to change. You can call it anything you want to. Here in the United States, the erratic weather patterns have caused significantly higher costs of management of farm operations. Worldwide, it continues to have a great deal of uncertainty, and it calls attention really to the need for larger data sets, for precision farming, for monitoring what's happening in the weather, and so that farmers can make adjustments, and so the food supply can stay more stable, and you have fewer of those food price spikes that we talked about a moment ago. Well, let me for a few minutes talk about the world in which I've been extremely involved since 2011. Any of us working internationally are working with other universities abroad. So I'm just looking here at the University of Missouri, linked to another university, wherever it's in India, Asia, Africa, and linking with our principal foreign affairs funding agency in the United States, the Agency for International Development. I was appointed in 2011 to chair an advisory group called BIFAD, Board for International Food and Agricultural Development, by then President Obama, and I was reappointed in 2016 for a 4-year term, so I will continue to serve through 2020 on the board. So it keeps me very involved with everything that's going on with USAID in different parts of the world and visiting countries where that work is underway. So the purpose of that linkage has been to leverage science and technology for global food security. I borrowed this slide when my colleague Katesh Kadi and I, who's in the medical school at Missouri, toured India and gave a series of talks, and then we presented this to the governor's staff down in Jefferson City, because it simply is a wonderful revelation with that big nuclear reactor we have on campus of the vibrancy of a university environment, whether it's Columbia, Missouri State, West Plains, or wherever. If you're with a group of knowledge seekers and knowledge builders, there is excitement in the room. And there is untold possibilities for resolving key problems that we have in the world. And I'll come back to that in force in a few minutes. So I love this slide only because it points to a frontier technology, green nanotechnology. Katesh Kadi on our faculty, radiology, Michael, you probably know him, is considered the father of green nanoscience in the world. So he continues to make tremendous contributions scientifically. I've talked about this before. I just want to reemphasize it because when you look at the potential on the agricultural side, you have to be concerned about the kind of yield increases that are going to be necessary worldwide, 75%, to meet the needs that we have and that we have been looking at earlier. Cropland may be declining in this country a bit. It's expanding in places in Africa as we find new solutions to soil additives, particularly in building soil in areas that have been depleted, actually, as time goes by. So we've got to be concerned about yield increases, importantly about cropping intensity, and then the land base as a whole. And I'll come back to this a moment when we talk about what USAID is emphasizing on intensification of agricultural production. And that's sustainable intensification, consistent with what you're focused on here. We've got to learn through science to get more out of what we have, not just in an economic efficiency sense, but in an ability to tap the very genomic content of what we're working with. And that's really the frontier that is being pursued in animals, in soils, in plants particularly, and in so many aspects of what we're doing in production. That also requires a broad sociological kind of perspective on the issues. It involves an understanding of the humanities to understand why people behave the way they do and why chieftains in certain parts of Africa, and if you're not familiar with the term chieftain, is basically the same as saying the mayor or the town manager in our country. It doesn't conjure up the historical romantic notion we had of chiefs. But as they allocate land in different ways, that entire profile of human behavior from all dimensions is brought to bear on the solution to the agricultural productivity and economic productivity of the area. So conservation is still important. Resilience is extremely important so that you can sustain any kind of shock that occurs and get past it and move on into a new productive frontier. An important point, and we can go back over some of this in Q&A if these aren't clear to you. The board I work with, I simply flash this up to say a couple of things historically. You know, Harry Truman from this state, you can say this in a nonpartisan way these days because Harry Truman is elevated beyond party. As his history goes on, his stature in the world keeps increasing. And that's because he was such a visionary after World War II when he emphasized his Point 4 program and said, what we have been doing to rebuild Europe should be extended to every country in the world so that poor, malnourished, underdeveloped areas can gain the benefits of what we have done, what science has done, what we can marshal from other more developed countries of the world to enable them to move into a position where they can be self-sustaining. They can make their own investments and can move ahead with the nutritional targets that their population needs and can improve their conditions. So shortly after that, actually, the University of Missouri then began working. One of the first, there were 6 universities that set out to rebuild universities in India and other parts of the world. And the University of Missouri was one of those who began to build a major university in Orissa that would do agricultural experimentation and get the word out to the public, much like our land-grant universities do in this country. So the University of Missouri has had a long history in dealing with these issues thanks to the kind of work that USAID does. Then in 1975, Representative Paul Finley and Senator Hubert Humphrey created this board, along with Title 12 Amendment to the Foreign Assistance Act of 1961, for those of you that are interested in the history of it, to advise USAID and to link what it's doing with the best knowledge we have in our universities. So that's what this group does. And at least four of the group have to be from the universities. Then the others represent business and the NGO sectors. And we convene 2 or 3 times a year and conduct studies and then work with USAID administration to set the tone that is carrying out in terms of our international development work. So our goal is to ensure what Harry Truman envisioned and what's been envisioned since then, an adequate and sustainable food supply in the world, and focusing on the most vulnerable populations, women and children particularly, so that they are brought into the mainstream and can contribute in a significant way. And we do that through linking in innovation laboratories, universities with what's happening with USAID in the field and with the private sector in this country to ensure that the projects that some of you at this university work on are carried out effectively with the best knowledge and the best science that we can bring to bear on the issues. So now there's actually, the figure here is 60, that's grown I believe to about 75 universities in the nation that are working with USAID on this, and I know some work here is going on with that, and on a variety of issues. And these universities, in the case of Missouri, for example, right now, we're deeply involved in the Soybean Innovation Lab, it's called, and that is looking at scientific breakthroughs in soybeans that enable soybeans to be used as both human and animal feed in East Africa, focusing heavily on Ghana, but branching out to many other countries, using many, many disciplines to get at this. And the University of Missouri is contributing heavily in the social science and humanities to this project. It's viewed as critical to success in feeding the growing population and that the most rapidly growing region of the world today, Africa. We work closely with the University of Illinois, Mississippi State University, Delaware State, and University of Maryland Eastern Shore, and a variety of non-governmental organizations, such as Catholic Relief Service. So any of you that are traveling to Ghana particularly, you're likely to run into a range of Missouri people, because this is an ongoing project, and it really illustrates what BIFAD has tried to advise on the best science to tackle key problems, and USAID funds that kind of work. We worked hard also to get a budget passed that would support this work with Congress the past couple of years, and the new funding for USAID, in spite of the call for a 35% reduction, actually was held constant, and the budget is over $1 billion in food security work alone, with about 70% of that going out to the missions around the world. And the research budget that supports universities is $55 million for these innovation labs and another $40–50 million in other kinds of research support. So that has not been daunted by the divisiveness and the, you might say, the American first. This is not inconsistent with the American first kind of issues that are being discussed nationally. Congress, in a bipartisan way, has stood solidly behind what USAID is trying to do, and that means what we as universities are trying to do. And that's something I think we can be very optimistic about. We are assisted in this work with a group of what's called CGIAR, Consultative Groups on International Agricultural Research. And some of you know this very well, but there are centers that have been established by foundations, Rockefeller, Ford, and by governments worldwide, including the United Nations, focusing on key issues on vegetable research, on animal research, on various types of grain research, on potato research in the tropics in Lima, Peru, for example, CIMMYT in Mexico, on and on and on. This is a set of partners who coordinate. USAID funding assists in that work. The World Bank provides funding. And so we're part of a global scientific platform for addressing these critical issues. And you here at Missouri State, you are part of that forum, and you're part of that coalition that says we are not going to be satisfied until these issues are dealt with properly. Now, I mentioned women a moment ago, and I wanted to focus on it because this has been a USAID focus, and BIFAD has strongly emphasized this because we have found that the role of women is so critical to what's going on in the world, because they make different kinds of decisions than their husbands or spouses or mates do. And my own work in Kenya discovered that using a food for work project where wages were paid in food rather than cash, hold everything else constant, that makes about a 30+% difference in the nutrient intake of those families. Women use their resources to ensure the quality of their children more than do men, unfortunately. So that's important to emphasize. Estimates have been made that if women today had the same access to education and training that men have in those countries, we would have 60 million fewer people in poverty today. That's a hard estimate, I believe, by the World Bank did that. So that's pretty profound. And so we've tried to steer programs toward focusing on women, integrating nutrition and agriculture particularly, and strengthening the capacity of those countries to do this themselves and to engage as partners. And we hope to phase our way out of country after country. And the new USAID administrator has made this a real priority. Let's look at the mix of ingredients that it takes to make those countries self-sustaining. So that's the track we're on, and we hope we can continue that. I mentioned science several times because it's so important, and work we're doing at the university. You could do it anywhere. When you look at climate change, such science as root systems. Bob Sharp in our soils program, some of you probably know him, is doing path-breaking work in coordination with Beijing Agricultural University in China and Leicester University in England. They're really leading the globe on how you modify root systems to address irrigation issues, to address drought conditions in the world, and to expand the capability for agricultural production. So this is only an example of other work that's going on. And when you think about the investments in agricultural sciences particularly, it's true of many of them, you cannot really overemphasize how important it is to look at a different way of looking at agriculture, integrating crop systems with livestock systems, integrating legumes and intercropping with other types of maize production and other grain production. A lot of experimentation is going on, and there's a lot of DNA splicing going on to ensure that the genetics enable that capacity to transform nutrients into productive food. So these problems go on and on. I was at the St. Louis Academy of Science last week, which recognized one of our animal scientists, Randy Prather, who does gene editing with livestock. And only one of his findings has led to a $6 million a day savings in the pork industry. Some of the pork respiratory syndrome has been alleviated by the transgenic pigs he produces. He's mainly producing models for human health and well-being. But in doing that, he's also made, with the modest investment we make in faculty, like many of you, you make an incredible contribution to the world's food-producing capability. And we're seeing that in area after area of science. And so I just wanted to highlight some of these, including particularly the use of genetic engineering to do things never dreamed of before, and we're only on the edge of what's going to be tremendous changes that are going to go on in the world of food production as we look to the future. Let me just take a few moments here at the end to go back to what I'm doing right now, given all that and my background, what I've observed as administrator of a major research university, my work with USAID. When I stepped away as chancellor, our board of curators asked me what I'd like to devote my energies to, and I emphasized that it was on eliminating hunger and extreme poverty in the world, joining what we've done with the United Nations, what USAID has done, and what many of you are doing through church and faith-based organizations worldwide. And so I was given the opportunity to develop an institute that began to draw on the very best of the university to tackle some of the issues we have in the world today, and focusing on multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, and what's increasingly called transdisciplinary research that enables public and private entities to address the various issues that they're associated with extreme poverty. So it may be a food-producing system, it may be organizing a cooperative, it may be looking at new seed adoption in KwaZulu-Natal and South Africa, which a group of our researchers have recently been doing. It takes multiple disciplines to really get at these issues and to blend them together in a new way of thinking so that we analyze the problems in different ways. So I've had our faculty very caught up in this with a big workshop on campus and drawing heavily and involving our students particularly so that they could contribute to the work that BIFAD is doing. I mentioned open data before, so that precision agriculture and crop diseases can be assessed. The Ebola crisis was due a lot to the global open data initiatives in the world that could look at broad masses of data in new and exciting ways. Not Facebook data, let me add, but other ways of acquiring data that could really relate to the issues. And then, in fact, we're working with a new technology and open chassis of tractors in Ghana right now, cooperation with a private sector entity that we're working with. So our goals are just what I think I've already said them here, and I won't belabor them. We sat down with our students after we'd had a couple of years' work, and we'd been working with a group called Presidents of Universities United to Solve Hunger, PUSH, P-U-S-H, which if Missouri State's not a member, I urge you to look at that and consider it. Auburn University is the secretariat of PUSH. Voluntary, no funding, something you just do, but you join in a real commitment to do something different. We had one of the big national conferences on our campus a couple of years ago, and it was extremely exciting for our students. So we sat down with our students and we said, what's happening in our university today that is not adding up for you? I mean, in other words, what's not happening? I'm sorry. What is not happening today? We're given all the activities you're involved in, and they wanted time to think about it and analyze it, and they said the fundamental thing that's lacking, we see, is interdisciplinary collaboration among students. You know, we can take different classes, but we don't have the ability to work together with each other to try to come up with solutions to problems. So we set out designing a system with them, and they developed a little, we have a student advisory group and a faculty advisory group. The student group led the planning and came up with a mission statement, and that was to explore the value of interdisciplinary teamwork, to understand their own role, and I'm speaking to each of you out there that is a student, particularly today, and saying, you know, what is your role and what you're majoring in helping solve this world food issue that we're dealing with? And then how do we empower local action to address global poverty? And that starts right here in your own community. If you're like most of our communities around the universities, probably 10 to 15% of your students are facing a food insecure situation today. There's a lot of malnourishment among students, a lot of unsureness about where the next dollar is coming from to feed themselves. And then it extends to all the 1,000+ international students you have on this campus. When they're back in their home community, you can communicate today in a way you never could before. And you can solve problems. So our students link up through the social media and work with NGOs in other parts of the world or former colleagues that have now graduated and gone back. This is heavily oriented toward undergraduate students, and with some graduate student participation. We don't necessarily rule it out. So what we do then during a semester, and I just want to make this real concrete, because Mike, we were talking about, can other universities do this? And the answer is, of course you can. We're happy to work with any university, let me say, in a collaborative way. We view this as the inspiring stimulus of getting students engaged and thinking about their contribution to the world. From this program, then, they can go on to experience, study abroad, or we have a lot of very specific experiential learning opportunities. It goes into the thousands of students that go abroad every year. We've got a group that go to Ghana to help with their nursing program, a group that goes to Vietnam to work with microcredit systems, and on and on and on. I could go on. It is not dissimilar from the kind of experience students gain in the semester break by going somewhere else in the United States. Those are all very valuable contributions that are made. But so we have a very specific framework at this point. We always have very inspirational speakers at the beginning and the end of the program. We have a team building experience. This is all extracurricular, not for credit. You could do it for credit. We're choosing to do it extracurricular. And it's worked out with great enthusiasm by the students. We expose them during the semester to a series of the best faculty we have on our campus that have had international experience, that are excited about their science and can tell them how to link their disciplines together with other disciplines. So it's very much of an orientation toward that. We then also have them, our mayor speaks to the group and talks about all the social service agencies in our own community they can get involved with. And many of them have faith-based relationships they're working with already. We then pair them up across disciplines, usually an international student also with a domestic student, an engineer with a nursing student, someone in human environmental science or nutrition with someone in business, for example. And we ask them to identify a problem and to write a strategy of how they would deal with it. And so that's what they're doing in the pairs. They build a real sense of trust with each other, and we have the trust-building activities built in as exercises. Then they submit a seed grant application at the end of the semester, and we try to identify funds to give at least 3 or 4 $500 grants, not very much money, to get them started into the next step. And our goal is to link them up then with private sector entities, with government entities, social service entities, and enable them to cultivate and develop their program more effectively. So that program stemmed from those early days when I was plowing with the water buffalo in Thailand, or working with a group of young people in Ecuador or Colombia, where I did in the summer. And we've tried to take the next step so that we could expose students earlier and bring them alive about the potential that they have in their own lives and their own capability, and in a sense maximize the value of their college education. So with that, I will pause and turn to question and answers. I didn't check the time, but we're okay, I think. Thank you so much for the chance to talk with you about this. Yeah.
Very good. We do have folks with microphones already taking their places in the aisles. If you've got a question, please raise your hand. I'd be glad to acknowledge you with questions for Dr. Deaton.
Hello. So I know you talked a lot about how we're trying to feed the growing population, soon to reach 10 billion. However, there's been a lot of articles written that food waste and improper food management could potentially, if these problems are fixed, we can solve the food crisis now. Is that true? And are there any programs in place through USAID or through BIFAD that you might currently be working on?
I couldn't quite hear you. If you would repeat that, and then I'll repeat your question. Thank you.
Yeah, so food waste and improper food management lead to a lot of different problems in feeding both the global population and our local, regional, national populations as well. Even though technically, if we didn't have these problems, we could feed the growing population, soon to reach 10 billion. And I was wondering if there are any programs in place that are currently being worked on through USAID or BIFAD.
Okay, so programs available through BIFAD to work on improving food production programs, particularly with wheat. Did I hear you correctly?
Waste.
Yeah, food waste.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Thanks very much. And the answer is emphatically yes. Addressing the issue of food waste is a very high priority with USAID, and BIFAD has ensured that we have programs on that. And you're right. I should have said this earlier. 35, you get to see a range of estimates, somewhere between 25 and 35. I've seen 40% estimates on food waste. It does include a wide range of things that if we could solve all of it, we could feed people across the world probably pretty easily today. But reducing it to close to zero is probably impossible. Yet it's something that we can improve right here on your campus. You can improve it with the way you organize your cafeteria, for example. And we've done, many of you, you're probably doing that already, or you can anyway, and trying to minimize the amount of food that students throw in the wastebasket. It goes all the way to you lose a lot to pests, to birds. Birds get a lot of the seed. Rats and mice get into the bags of the granaries. We gave an award, BIFAD gave an award 2 years ago to a person who had invented a new bag from Purdue University, in fact. Somebody else here in the audience probably remembers his name, which I don't right now. But it's a very famous new application of technology that reduces the amount of waste in grain to a very significant degree in different parts of the world. So we should have as a goal cutting in half at a minimum. Cut in half the amount of food waste. That figure has not reduced in my professional career. When I first started, I kept hearing, oh, we're wasting 35% of our food. Well, we still are. And yet there's been many, many improvements made, but at the same time, we've slid back. So we're looking for great ideas there. So you students really should give this very high priority. And it touches on every aspect of what you do, how you prepare food, the way you peel parts of your food. So if you think of the various disciplines that go into that, customs, from the customs and the way the household functions to the technologies involved. It's a very rich area for doing something positive. Thanks. Carried away.
Thank you. Other questions?
Okay, so currently the U.S. gives less than 1% to foreign aid, less than 1% of their federal budget to foreign aid, and we give, I believe, one of the lowest amounts of our GNI compared to other developed countries. Do you think the U.S., as one of the leading nations in the world, should be doing more to fight global poverty?
Just go ahead.
So,
So you were asking basically, should the United States be doing more, if I got where we were now spending less than 1% on food aid issue, or not food aid, but on food security issues. And, let me say, I can only speak from a value standpoint. Clearly, I think we should be doing substantially more. But that's a question that has to be addressed by the society at large. And that's why this program you have here is so vitally important, that the public understands it. And we have to be working in partnership, and this is something that's missed a lot. We have to work in partnership with the countries that we're working with. They have to be responsible as well, and they aren't in many, many cases. The issues of governance, we still have too much corruption in too many places, and every aspect of that is vitally important. But it is important to recognize how relatively little we actually give for a very rich country. That figure does not include the amount that's given through private means. And that's worth pointing out because the European countries that are higher in terms of total amount would fall way down when it comes to private in many cases because a lot of their giving is through their church-related links with the state. But that's not to excuse anything. I'm with you 100% and wanting more done. But it's got to be constructive, and it's got to draw on the best of the science that we know and the best of our understanding of the humanities and the social sciences in this transdisciplinary kind of perspective. That's when you start really seeing a difference. And using only science and technology, we have misdiagnosed some of the most incredible issues in the world. And you bring someone who had an English or music background and suddenly, whoa, okay, that makes sense. I wish I could come up with a real quick example of that, but I'm not right now, but it's true. Communications. We've seen massive issues of parts of the society not knowing what was even available to them because they simply don't communicate with other parts of the society. That's the KwaZulu-Natal example I could elaborate on, but I'm just trying to make the basic point of the need for different disciplines. A communications person diagnosed that very quickly. It got resolved.
Thank you. Are there any other questions?
Thanks for a great talk, Dr. Deaton. I'm interested in what work might be underway for recapturing desert lands. We hear about the Sahara and maybe the Gobi and a few others, deserts that are enlarging. But when I was in Saudi Arabia, I lived on their desert for about 6 months. We'd go on helicopters and we'd see these beautiful areas that were maybe a kilometer in diameter, and they were areas where they dug a very deep well and they were very fertile. We know the deserts are fertile if they just bring water. So right. What efforts are being done along those lines?
So the question is about what work is being done in order to try to reverse desertification, still make some of those areas productive.
Yeah. Michael, an excellent question. I think you pointed out that a lot of what we see as desert today used to be very productive, verdant land. And 2 or 3 things quickly. One is, of course, tapping underground water through wells and pumps of various sorts to actually engage in irrigation. The USAID is right now exploring small-scale irrigation systems as well for wells and pumps, as well as transportation, perhaps, from rivers and lakes. The water issue is a big issue. And other strategies that are being undertaken include managing the livestock that graze the land, often down to where it's denuded, and then it erodes and wind blows, and you've got a new segment of desert. So managing the livestock more effectively and producing forage in areas where they do not have to graze extensively is a strategy that's being undertaken. And I mentioned a Food for Work project that I studied in Kenya is up toward the Turkana district in the northern part of the Rift Valley. And there they were using to slow down water where there was some rain and winds. It was blowing away the little bit of soil that was there. So they had methods of saving that soil through using locally grown brush and using it as a fence to keep the livestock away from it, and then to use sticks and stones in patterns that conserved the amount of the little bit of water that was there, and led to then more forage being produced and reducing again the livestock pressure on other parts of the land. So there are multiple ways of going about that issue. And someone that comes from a cultural anthropology background may have other ways of dealing with some cultural practices perhaps that would change that as well. So it is an important topic and one that is being given quite a bit of attention from a technological standpoint.
Thank you very much. Other questions for Dr. Deaton?
Dr. Deaton, I have a question. I really appreciated so many of the comments, and one, though, that I wanted you to expand upon is the issue of women. That's a phenomenal kind of a comment about how we could improve. And then the one that connects with it is that other statement of bartering instead of money. I don't know. I may have oversimplified that, but would you say a little bit more about?
Yeah, so the question was an invitation to talk more about the role of women and also about the food for labor programs.
Oh, okay. Okay, well, you have to stop me on that one. Let me start by talking about, I'll get to the project in a moment, but the role of women in general. I can still remember an international meeting I attended in Nairobi in 1976. And I happened to be caught up in a conversation with T.W. Schultz. If anyone in economics, certainly we know him. He won the Nobel Prize in economics. He had just been out visiting some small rural communities, and he attended an extension session, and it was only men coming to the extension program, learning new science and technology. Then he went out in the field the next day, and everyone working in the field were women. And he said, you know, this something's really wrong here. And he told then we had about 1,000 people attending an international conference. He told them all about this, and it launched a new series of studies on women in development. But I can never forget that conversation because it was so profound for me. We have simply ignored the local mores and child-rearing practices and social structure that led us to waste a lot of our information efforts with people who weren't going to be using them. And so then the women who weren't getting the benefits of that didn't have it to use. You know, you couldn't depend on pillow talk, you might say, to transfer that kind of learning technology. So now that's changed, and USAID has placed a lot of emphasis working with those societies in finding, again, the cultural ways to work with the local society in a way that doesn't bruise them. I mean, we don't come in imperialistically, but finding ways to tap that capability of women, and starting with young children, in fact, and girls in school, empowering them, enabling them to realize they're as important as anyone else in this society. So that's all very much an emphasis on all of USAID programming today, and efforts are made to understand the issues and translate what we're trying to do in that regard. That's why I said that estimates were that there would be 60 million fewer people, and that by that they simply looked at where the programs had not reached the women and then looked at the differentials in production, as you can imagine. Now, I was actually in a community where this was a World Food Program, was looking actually at some of these irrigation, dry land systems to try to control water, and water harvesting techniques was the focus of it. But the people working on it were all men. They were doing hard labor, cutting brush, carrying stones and sticks. So there were about 200 men working in this community in a very targeted area. And they were paid 100% for their work with food, wage equivalent in food. So I had a doctoral student at the time, Mesfin Bazuna, who's gone on to be a great faculty member at Clark Atlanta University. So I can brag on him here. He did a great dissertation on this subject. And he followed the work of Angus Deaton, in fact, who, again, recently won the Nobel Prize in economics. He looked at a sample of the population that were not working on the food for work, but had a level of income equivalent to what the other families had, plus adding their food in as wage equivalent. So that was done very carefully so that you could legitimately compare the household nutritional intake of families of equal income, but where about a fourth to a half of their income was food in one case and strictly wages in the other case. And then we documented the amount of nutrient households that had the food for work had over 30% improvement in fats, protein, nutrients. We did a documentation of that. It was a profound difference in food consumption. And of course, the World Food Program, which is part of the United Nations, and USAID and BIFAD's work also make sure they get contributed to every year. They were doing amazing work in this population. We talked to the men then, and we said, hey, do you rather be paid in food or wages? They all said, wages. We like wages. So we said, oh, that's interesting, well, maybe there'll be a program like that one of these days. Then we went ahead and did the measurement. So in spite of what they said, their households were far better off in terms of nutrient intake. We also measured the amount, and any economists in the room will appreciate this. We said if you have higher wages, basically, due to food, what would you be doing with the quote-unquote excess income you have? And we looked at whether or not there had been an induced effect on how they improved their agricultural production of their own small subsistence farm, and found a significant, about a 20% increase in what we called capital formation through improved fences, improved roofings, improved water management on their own little place. And so we estimated from that if this World Food Program would go on for about 5 years, you wouldn't need any more food aid in that part of the country. We actually did a restudy on that, and it was an amazing, successful program. That's all written up in journals, so I can document that at some point. But it makes the point on women. If women are concerned about their children, men are concerned about them too. But the mores of the way men behave is different from women. And we've got to understand that and build it into our programming of aid-related work, which we at that point had not done very well at all. So I appreciate the question, Nancy.
Yeah. We'll take just one more question in respect for your time.
We often hear that American farmers feed the world, right? But in reality, often the oversupply of commodities are dumped on world markets and undermines local markets around the world. And this is often linked to rural-urban migration and the loss of labor in rural areas, et cetera, et cetera. Could the reduction in American productivity be good for the world in terms of food supply?
Well, just a blunt answer is, I'd say very unlikely. And that's because we have examined in our studies of food aid all those studies that have been done of potential disincentives. And there's no question but what you can find cases where food from the United States that was in surplus was shipped at the wrong time and had a damaging effect perhaps on prices. But that is very, very rare. And the good reasons for that, in almost all cases, and we've studied this extensively, our food aid is programmed jointly with that country and local managers and the aid mission. They work with the government there to ensure that those farmers are protected from a price standpoint. So they manage the value chain or the processing. They often guarantee prices then at a world market level, without the surplus food, to their own farmers. And in fact, in Kenya, where I was doing this study, that was the case. And they were actually shipping in a lot of the food from nearby. They also were shipping the food from Zambia in this case, not from the United States. So there is a global market in food. And anytime there's a surplus, that means someone is eating food at a cheaper rate somewhere. When you eat food at a cheaper rate, you free up more income to buy something else. And it's those dynamics that's why I mentioned the inducement on capital formation a moment ago. If you study those, the disincentive case goes away to in almost all cases. It also saves foreign exchange. We did a series of studies of Tunisia, particularly in a published version of the Tunisian study. We did several countries where you've got to look at when food comes in and the country has been purchasing food, they save on foreign exchange, and that foreign exchange is used somewhere else to help the country. And so you have to look at a dynamic set of changes that occur. I don't want to totally take away from the point you're making, because it's a point that has to be looked at very carefully. It has been overblown in a lot of the literature, and a lot of groups have used it. But it needs to be very carefully studied in all cases. So I appreciate you raising that.
Ladies and gentlemen, let me remind you that one of the icons that we have on our campus is of the citizen scholar. It's a woman that holds the world in her hands. And I think that what we heard last night from Dr. Ballard, what we've heard tonight from Dr. Deaton underscores the role that women have in leadership and making decisions for their families. And I applaud not only Dr. Deaton, but for just the idea that folks from many backgrounds, whether it's dietetics or engineering or agronomy, would weigh in and share what they have learned in order to improve the quality of life on the planet. So, Dr. Deaton, I thank you for being here. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Dr. Deaton for his contributions to our program.
Okay, thanks so much. Appreciate that.